Right, well, thank you, and that was a great introduction to the problem of wasps and bees. So we'll give you a talk about where we're at with Vespex. It's now been more broadly available outside of experimental use, which Doc has been using it for a while, but we've now coming out of our second season where it's been more broadly available for people. So just going back to 2015, where there was a trial of Vespex to see if we could get good conservation gains. That was a collaborative effort between Department of Conservation, BASF, Intercoal, and a whole group of NGOs who provide a lot of manpower for this. That research was done over 5 honeydew beech forest sites in the South Island, which ranged from 217 hectares up to the largest, which was a bit under 2,500 hectares. The bait stations in those areas were put out at a grid of 300 by 50 metres, which equates to a little over one bait station per hectare, with a little higher density on the edges and in the smaller sites. Before baiting, we did a standardised protein activity testing procedure where you put out a row of bait lids with some non-toxic protein food on there, and you actually count the number of wasps that visit the protein after an hour. And that's a critical point for knowing that the wasps have reached significant interest in protein, that the baiting's going to work. Bait was put out just once, and that was in February, mid-February for these trials, and it was left out for a maximum of 7 days. While this was going on, there was wasp nest traffic rates were counted in all of the areas, both before and 1 week after the treatment. And they were also monitoring the availability of the honeydew on the beech trees, just to see what the response was with honeydew availability. So results of that, as you see the vertical line on the end, we had a target reduction of 90% of wasp activity, and we knew that was a threshold we were really beginning to get good biodiversity gains. And you can see from that graph that we exceeded that in all 5 of the sites, and that was after 1 week. So after 1 week, there was an average reduction that was in excess of 95%. So most of the sites were also monitored a little bit longer, and after 1 month, the actual average reduction in activity in those areas was greater than 99%. So very successful in that respect. And in terms of honeydew recovery, if you see on the bars on the left-hand side, that's when we establish the plots on the beech trees. It's a little higher than immediately before, because in those forests, and able to find good trees with honeydew, you have to do it before the wasps are a massive problem. But immediately beforehand, you see in this particular example in Abel Tasman, just before the trial, the treated area had less honeydew available than the non-treated area, as it turned out. But 1 week after baiting, there's immediate response from the amount of honeydew, and after a month, that was even greater, and it was obviously continuing over the season. And we certainly noticed that suddenly there's an increase in the number of bees able to be found on those beech forest trunks. So that's all well and good for biodiversity purposes, and the product was really developed originally for wide area wasp control in beech forests of the South Island, but it's now being used across a wide variety of habitats and areas of the country, from the far north down to even Stewart Island. And obviously for a lot of users, particularly in this room, biodiversity benefits are often not the primary goal of undertaking wasp control, and smaller site level control is often what people are looking for. So protein activity testing is one of the real key factors for success for using the bait. It's not a product you can just throw out there as soon as you see a wasp and think it's going to do the job. You really need to know that wasps are feeding on protein. And of course, with all these new habitats, there's different populations of wasps, and so different thresholds for what level of interest in protein we need to reach for the bait to be effective. So originally in our honeydew beech forest, we were looking at an average of about 1 wasp per non-toxic bait after it's been left out for 1 hour. But in many habitats, particularly in the North Island, the actual density of wasps the carrying capacity is much lower. So we've actually adjusted that now for those environments where you only really need half a wasp per non-toxic bait after an hour. Competing protein resources can also be an issue we've found. In nature, that can take the form you have outbreaks of caterpillars on canopy trees, and the wasps will literally be feeding on whatever protein resource is easiest to get at the time. So if you've suddenly got this big outbreak of caterpillars, the wasps are focused on that. They're not actually looking for other sources of protein. And we've also had incidences like at a golf club where people were planning to do a poisoning operation for wasps, but the week before they did a cull of rabbits, and there were rabbit carcasses all over the course. So what that meant is the wasps are so focused going to the rabbit carcasses, they don't need to look for any other protein resource. So it can be a bit of a challenge on those occasions. And we've also had a similar example with deer carcasses. Giant willow aphids, obviously as we've heard, are now fueling big populations of wasps in new areas. And that means there's a lot of wasps around the willow trees themselves. But we've noticed there can be poor uptake of protein baits in the immediate vicinity of those willows. And we know carbohydrates can be a real limiting factor for wasp populations. And in this slide, there's a very simplified graph where you've got the wasp nest underground there and a willow tree in the middle. What we know is wasps actually travel further for carbohydrates than they will for protein, and they habituate to keep coming back to those great sites for carbohydrate to get their fuel before they go off and undertake other activities. But in terms of collecting protein, they tend to do that within under 450 metres from the nest, occasionally further, but mostly those journeys are quite short. So in this graph you can see if you did wasp baiting around the willow tree, there's actually only one of those wasp nests that's likely to be affected. So many wasps visiting the willows may not actually be foraging there for protein. So that gives us some challenges for small sites. You may not be targeting the more distant nests, although having a higher density of bait stations around those sites increases the probability that wasps from more distant sites will visit the station. But you still may observe plenty of wasps at those key honeydew resources there. And more distant nests will fill the competition void because you've taken out a lot of the competition, so wasps from further afield will come and visit that site. So in those cases, with small sites, repeat baiting may be necessary. Pre-baiting is an option in such situations, and in that case you're putting out a non-toxic protein and habituating the wasps to visit those stations. And that's a really practical option for smaller sites, not so if you're doing hundreds of hectares. And that may lead to better success of wasp control at smaller sites and also at lower wasp densities, and may lead to better control also at more distant nests, and replaces the need for that protein activity testing. What are we working on at the moment? One of the things that currently is packaged in fairly large containers, frozen product. We're looking to move it towards single bait units with tear top packaging, make it more easy to put out. We're looking at the addition of a palatable hydrogel to delay drying in the field. Vespex tends to go quite dry in hot, windy climates, and you can see there are a lot of wasps were feeding on that particular trial. And we're also looking at proving the stability of the product so we can keep it out of the freezer for much longer. So thanks for listening to that, and we're always keen to get feedback of your experience and particularly what's worked for you, because that enables us to improve advice to other beekeepers. Thank you.